I'm afraid you've wandered into the wrong room. Perhaps the service entrance is still open.
I cannot believe she actually hit her. There, in front of everyone! Who does she think she is?
The crystal chandeliers of the Getty Center in Los Angeles didn't just sparkle. They felt like thousands of judgmental eyes looking down on Zaria Reed as she stood in the shadows of the ballroom, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to the sea of emeralds and silk worn by the elite of California. She wasn't here to dance, she was here to watch Chloe, the 4-year-old daughter of Ethan Park, the $900 billion CEO of Park Aerospace, who was currently the most targeted bachelor in the room. To the world, Zaria was just the help, a beautiful black woman hired to keep the prince's daughter silent and fed, but they didn't know that the gold band she wore on a silk cord beneath her dress was an identical match to the one Ethan had etched into his own skin. If you're ready to see what happens when a billionaire stops playing by the rules to protect the woman he loves, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now because the world is about to find out exactly who Zaria Reed really is. Bianca Huntington, a socialite whose family owned half of Beverly Hills, approached the refreshment table with a glass of champagne and a sneer that was as sharp as her diamond necklace, her eyes fixed on Ethan, who was currently surrounded by senators from Washington and tech moguls from Silicon Valley. Bianca had spent the last hour trying to catch Ethan's attention, only to see his gaze constantly drifting toward the Nanny in the corner, a realization that was fueling a venomous rage in the socialite's chest. "You," Bianca barked, her voice cutting through the soft orchestral music like a serrated blade, gesturing toward Zaria as if she were a piece of furniture that needed moving. "The child spilled juice on my train, and you're standing there like a statue. Do your job and clean it up before I have you thrown out of this gala and back into the streets of Washington, D.C. Zaria didn't flinch. She stood her ground with a regal grace that seemed to infuriate Bianca even more, her mahogany skin glowing under the warm LED lights as she looked the socialite directly in the eye with a calm, unshakable dignity. "I am here to care for Chloe, Miss Huntington, not to serve as your maid," Zaria replied, her voice a calm, smooth resonance that made several nearby executives turn their heads in surprise, the silence spreading like a cold front across the ballroom floor. The air in the Getty Center seemed to freeze as Bianca's face turned a mottled shade of crimson, her hand flying up in a blur of motion that no one expected in a room full of cameras and billionaires, the sound of the slap echoing like a gunshot off the glass walls. Zaria's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, but she didn't cry, she simply reached down to steady a terrified Chloe, while Bianca stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with the thrill of finally exerting power over the woman she despised. But the silence that followed wasn't for Bianca. It was for the man who was walking across the ballroom, his obsidian black eyes fixed on the red mark blooming on Zaria's cheek. Ethan Park didn't look like a CEO in that moment. He looked like a god of war who had just found his target, his tailored tuxedo unable to hide the raw, violent tension in his shoulders as he shoved aside a waiter to reach her. He didn't go to Bianca, he didn't check the child. He walked straight to Zaria and did something that made the entire high society of Los Angeles drop their glasses in unison. He dropped to one knee on the polished marble floor, his head bowed as he took Zaria's hand in his voice a low, lethal vibration that could be heard in the farthest corners of the room. "Forgive me, my queen," Ethan whispered, his words a death sentence for Bianca's reputation and a shockwave to the Park family legacy. "I let them believe you were a servant for too long, but the charade ends tonight." Before Bianca could even stammer an apology, Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a document that changed the world forever. What it revealed wasn't just a marriage certificate, it was a map to a $900 billion betrayal that had been years in the making. The air in the Getty Center didn't just turn cold, it became a vacuum of absolute disbelief as the golden seal on the marriage certificate Ethan held up caught the light of the chandeliers, blinding the socialites who had spent the last hour whispering about Zaria's low-class status. Bianca Huntington stumbled back, her heels catching on the hem of her ruined silk dress, her face a mask of ghostly terror as she realized the woman she had just assaulted was legally the most powerful person in the room. Ethan stood up slowly, his height looming over the crowd like a mountain of dark, immovable granite, his hand never leaving Zaria's as he looked at the security team with a gaze that promised total annihilation for anyone who dared to blink. This isn't just a marriage certificate, Ethan's voice boomed, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to make the very glass walls of the Los Angeles Museum tremble with his authority. This is a deed of joint ownership, stipulating that Zaria Reed Park holds 51% of the voting rights to Park Aerospace and every subsidiary from Washington, D.C. to Connecticut. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom, louder than the orchestral music that had long since died away, as the Nanny everyone had mocked was revealed to be the true owner of the very chairs they were sitting on. Madam Park, Ethan's mother, finally broke through the crowd, her face a contorted map of aristocratic fury and desperation as she looked at the paper in her son's hand. "Ethan, you've lost your mind. You can't grant a servant that kind of power. This is a fabrication, a desperate move to protect a girl who belongs in the gutter," the matriarch screamed, her voice shrill and desperate as she tried to snatch the document. But Ethan didn't flinch, he simply signaled to his lead counsel, who stepped out of the shadows with a phalanx of legal aides, each carrying a tablet that began to broadcast the official record of the marriage to every news outlet in California and New York simultaneously. Zaria stepped forward, her mahogany skin radiant under the lights, her eyes fixed on Bianca with a level of regal calm that made the socialite slap feel like a pathetic tantrum from a child. "I didn't stay silent for 3 years because I was afraid of you, Bianca," Zaria said, her voice a smooth, lethal silk that cut through the silence of the room. "I stayed silent because I was building the evidence of how your family and Madam Park were embezzling funds from the aerospace project in Connecticut." Bianca's eyes went wide, her mouth falling open as she looked toward Madam Park, who had suddenly gone as pale as the marble floor beneath her. The betrayal in the room shifted from personal to corporate in a heartbeat, the high-stakes drama of the Park family's secret marriage becoming the centerpiece of a multi-billion-dollar criminal investigation. Ethan leaned in close to Bianca, his voice a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "You slapped the woman who was currently deciding whether or not to foreclose on your father's estate in Beverly Hills. I hope the thrill of that one moment was worth the total bankruptcy of your family's legacy." He turned back to the crowd, his arm wrapping around Zaria's waist in a possessive, protective embrace that signaled the dawn of a new dynasty. "The Huntington family is barred from any further dealings with Park Global, and my mother is officially removed from the board of directors effective immediately." Madam Park let out a strangled sound of protest, but the federal marshals Kalen had secretly invited to the gala were already moving toward her, their badges gleaming with a cold, clinical justice. Zaria looked at Ethan, the weight of the last 3 years finally lifting off her shoulders as she saw the pride and love in his eyes, a look that told her she was no longer a ghost in his world. But just as the guards began to lead the disgraced socialites away, a man in a gray suit who had been standing near the exit let out a sharp, piercing whistle. That stopped everyone in their tracks. He wasn't looking at Ethan or the marshals, he was looking at Chloe, the small child who was still clutching Zaria's hand. "The marriage is real, Ethan," the man called out, his voice echoing with a dark, mocking tone that made Zaria's heart stop. "But the child isn't yours, and I think it's time Zaria told the world who the real father of the $900 billion heir is." The world seemed to tilt on its axis once again as Zaria felt Ethan's grip on her hand tighten until it was almost painful, his obsidian eyes searching hers for a truth she had hoped to keep buried forever. What she said next changed the history of the Park family forever, revealing a secret even Ethan wasn't prepared to handle. The air in the Getty Center turned from cold to suffocatingly heavy as Marcus Thorne, a disgraced former operative from the Washington, D.C. intelligence circles, stepped fully into the light, his smirk a jagged scar across the high society perfection of the evening. Ethan's hand, which had been a warm, solid anchor on Zaria's waist, suddenly went rigid as the word paternity echoed through the ballroom, a toxic cloud that threatened to poison the very air of their hard-won victory. Every camera in the room, previously focused on Bianca's disgrace, now swiveled toward Zaria, their lenses like predatory eyes waiting for a flicker of guilt to cross her mahogany features. Madam Park let out a sharp, triumphant laugh that cut through the silence like a vulture's cry, her eyes gleaming with a newfound hope that she could finally strip Zaria of her title and her child. "I knew it," the matriarch shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I knew a girl from the streets of Washington could never be trusted to carry the Park name. She played you, Ethan, and she used that child as a $900 billion anchor to your bank account. Ethan's obsidian eyes never left Zaria's face, searching for a sign, a tremor, anything that would tell him the man in the gray suit was lying, but Zaria remained as still as a statue carved from obsidian and grace. She didn't look at Marcus, she didn't look at the crowd, she looked only at Ethan, her voice a low, steady resonance that didn't have a single crack in its foundation. "Ethan, look at her," Zaria whispered, her hand moving to stroke Chloe's hair, the child hiding her face in Zaria's neck. "Look at the girl you've raised for 4 years and tell me you believe a man who was fired for perjury in Connecticut." Marcus laughed, pulling a sealed envelope from his pocket and waving it toward the cameras, the white paper a beacon of scandal that made the stock price of Park Aerospace twitch on the digital boards. "This is a DNA profile from a private lab in Massachusetts, Ethan, and it shows a 0% match between you and the girl," Marcus shouted, his voice filled with the thrill of a man who thought he had finally found the CEO's Achilles heel. Ethan took the envelope, his fingers trembling with a rage that was so intense it felt like he was holding a live wire, and for a heartbeat, the entire world of California's elite held its breath. But before he could rip it open, Zaria stepped forward, her regal natural hair framing a face that had transitioned from a victim to a judge in the span of a single breath. "Open it, Ethan," Zaria commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made Marcus's smirk falter. "Open it and show the world that Marcus Thorne forgot one crucial detail about my time in Washington." Ethan tore the paper, his eyes scanning the data with the clinical speed of a man who dealt in billion-dollar analytics, and then he let out a sound that wasn't a sob, but a growl of pure, unadulterated triumph. He didn't drop the paper, he held it up for the cameras, showing that while the DNA didn't match him, it also didn't match Marcus Thorne. "This report shows that Chloe is 100% matched to my late brother, Junho," Ethan announced, his voice a thunderous declaration that shook the museum's foundations. "The brother who was murdered in Connecticut 5 years ago, the brother whose estate was stolen by my mother and Marcus Thorne." The ballroom erupted in a frenzy of whispers as the truth began to unravel, Zaria's secret being revealed as a mission of mercy and justice rather than one of deception. She hadn't lied about the child's importance, she had protected the true heir to the Park family's original fortune from the very people who had tried to erase him. Zaria looked at Madame Park, whose face was now a mask of pure, unmitigated horror as she realized her own crimes were being dragged into the light. "You thought I was a nanny, Madame Park," Zaria said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade of total destruction. "But I was the legal guardian. Appointed by Junho before he died, and Ethan didn't marry me for a child, he married me to finish the war you started. But that was only the beginning of the reckoning." What Marcus Thorne said next changed the stakes once more, revealing a hidden camera feed from the Connecticut estate that showed someone else was already inside their home. Marcus Thorne's face twisted into a grotesque mask of desperation as he tapped his smartphone, projecting a grainy, high-contrast security feed onto the massive digital screens of the Getty Center for all of California's elite to see. The image showed the interior of the Park family's private estate in Connecticut, specifically the nursery where Chloe usually slept, but as the camera panned, it revealed a hidden panel behind the mahogany bookshelf sliding open to expose a high-tech vault. A figure dressed in tactical black was systematically stripping the vault of its contents, moving with a clinical, lethal speed that suggested they knew the security codes better than Ethan himself. "You thought you won, Ethan, but while you were busy playing hero in Los Angeles, my associates are erasing the only proof that your brother was ever in Connecticut that night," Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with a final, desperate venom as the crowd gasped at the brazenness of the heist. Ethan's grip on Zaria's hand tightened, his knuckles turning white as he felt the foundations of his 5-year search for justice beginning to crumble in real time, but Zaria didn't panic, she leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she studied the movements of the intruder on the screen. "That's not your associate, Marcus," Zaria whispered, her voice a low, lethal hum that made the villain's smirk falter once again. She pulled a slim, custom-built tablet from her evening clutch, her fingers dancing across the glass with the precision of a master architect, and suddenly the feed on the ballroom screens flickered, shifting from the grainy intruder view to a crystal-clear, 4K resolution that showed the intruder's face. The ballroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence as the world saw the face of Garrison Ford, Ethan's own chief of security, the man who had been standing guard over the Park legacy for a decade. The betrayal hit Ethan like a physical blow, his obsidian eyes flashing with a mix of grief and a cold, predatory rage that made the air around him feel like it was vibrating with electricity. Garrison was the one who helped my mother hide the evidence, Ethan growled, his voice a low-frequency rumble of total war. He didn't just fail me, he helped kill my brother. But that was only the beginning of the reveal, as Zaria tapped one final command on her tablet, triggering a remote lockdown of the Connecticut estate that sounded like a series of rhythmic, heavy thuds through the Getty Center sound system. On the screen, every exit of the mansion was sealed with reinforced titanium plates, trapping Garrison inside the vault with the very evidence he was trying to destroy. Zaria looked at Madame Park, who was now clutching her emerald necklace so tightly it looked like she was trying to choke herself, her aristocratic mask finally shattered beyond repair. "I knew Garrison was a mole 2 years ago, Ethan," Zaria said, her voice projecting with a regal, terrifying clarity. "That's why I took the job as the nanny. I needed to be inside the house to plant the counter-surveillance that just locked your mother's killer in a cage of her own making." Ethan looked at his wife, the realization dawning on him that the woman he had spent 3 years protecting had actually been the one protecting him, her servant persona being the ultimate tactical camouflage. He didn't just see a queen, he saw a partner, a brilliant strategist who had outplayed the most dangerous people in the District of Columbia and New York without ever raising her voice. He stepped toward Marcus Thorne, who was now backed against a glass railing, the federal marshals closing in with a clinical, heavy focus. "You tried to weaponize my family against me, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice a silk-wrapped promise of total annihilation. "But you forgot that Zaria Reed Park doesn't just hold the title, she holds the power." He signaled to Silas, his trusted aide, who moved to escort Chloe to a secure location, while Ethan turned back to the crowd, his arm wrapping around Zaria in a gesture of absolute, unyielding possession. The gala was no longer a celebration of wealth, it was the scene of a grand execution, and the Park dynasty was being reborn in a fire of justice and mahogany-brown skin. But as the marshals led Marcus away, the screens in the ballroom flickered one last time, revealing a hidden room in the Connecticut mansion that even Zaria hadn't mapped, a room containing a figure who shouldn't have been alive. What she saw next changed the history of the Park family forever, revealing that the dead brother might be the ultimate shadow player in this $900 billion game. The silence that fell over the Getty Center was no longer just a vacuum, it was a grave, cold and absolute, as every billionaire and socialite in Los Angeles stared at the 4K screens in paralyzed horror. The hidden room in the Connecticut mansion, illuminated by the flickering emergency lights of Zaria's lockdown, revealed a man sitting in a medical chair, his face a hollow, scarred reflection of Ethan's own. Junho Park, the brother the world had mourned for 5 years, was breathing. He wasn't a corpse in a cemetery in Massachusetts, he was a prisoner in his own home, his eyes dull but widening as he realized the surveillance cameras were finally watching him. Madame Park let out a sound that wasn't human, a high-pitched, warbling wail of a trapped animal as she realized her greatest sin had just been broadcast to the global elite. Ethan's hand dropped from Zaria's, his body vibrating with a primal, tectonic rage that seemed to dim the very chandeliers above them, his obsidian eyes fixed on the image of the brother he had failed to protect. "You kept him in a cage," Ethan whispered, his voice a low-frequency death rattle that made the federal marshals tighten their grip on Marcus Thorne. "You didn't just steal his company, you stole his very existence." Zaria moved instantly, her strategic mind already bypassing the shock as she tapped a sequence into her tablet to override the life support sensors in the Connecticut vault, ensuring Junho's medical equipment remained powered despite the lockdown. "Ethan, we have 20 minutes before the backup generators in Connecticut cycle out," Zaria said, her voice a silk-wrapped command that cut through his paralyzing fury. "We don't have time for her tears, we need to get to the private jet." The transition from the high-gloss gala to the tactical reality of their war was instantaneous, Zaria leading the way through the stunned crowd with the regal natural hair of a queen and the cold precision of a general. Behind them, Bianca Huntington was being dragged out in handcuffs, her screams for mercy ignored by the very people who had toasted her an hour ago, while Madame Park collapsed into the arms of the marshals, her white silk dress now a shroud for her reputation. As they sprinted toward the helipad on the Getty roof, the cool California wind whipping Zaria's navy dress around her legs, Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadow of the helicopter's spinning blades. "You knew, didn't you?" Ethan roared over the noise, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, heartbreaking need for truth. "When you took the job as the nanny, you weren't just looking for ledgers, you were looking for him." Zaria didn't blink, her mahogany skin glowing under the helipad lights as she looked at the man she had married in secret. "I didn't know he was alive, Ethan, but I knew the floor plans of that house didn't match the foundation records I found in Washington, D.C., she shouted back, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "I stayed because I felt a ghost in those halls, and I wasn't leaving until I found out whose it was." Ethan pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt, rain, and a decade of unvented grief, a possessive, desperate claim that signaled they were no longer playing a game of secrets. They scrambled into the helicopter, the Los Angeles skyline falling away as they began the high-speed transit toward the airport, but as Zaria looked at her tablet one last time, the feed from the Connecticut vault went black. A second, unauthorized signal had hijacked the estate's mainframe, and a voice crackled through the helicopter's headset, a voice that was smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar to anyone in the Sterling or Park inner circles. "Hello, Zaria," the voice whispered, chilling the air in the cabin. "You were very clever to lock the doors, but you forgot that I'm the one who designed the key." What they didn't know yet was that the intruder in tactical black wasn't just a security guard, and the war for the $900 billion legacy had just invited a new player into the boardroom. The hum of the private jet's engines felt like a racing heartbeat as Zaria Reed Park sat across from Ethan, her fingers flying across a holographic display that flickered with the dying code of the Connecticut estate's mainframe. The voice through the headset, the smooth, chilling tone of Arthur Sterling, a rival billionaire who had been lurking in the shadows of the Washington legal world, still echoed in her mind, a reminder that the war for the $900 billion legacy had layers even she hadn't fully peeled back. "He's not just overriding the lock, Ethan," Zaria whispered, her voice a low, lethal hum of concentration as the jet descended through the thick gray clouds over the Connecticut coastline. "Arthur Sterling was the one who provided the medical tech to keep Junho hidden. He's been holding your brother as a long-term insurance policy against your mother's debts." Ethan's obsidian eyes were fixed on the tactical map, his jaw set in a line of such absolute, predatory focus that he looked less like a CEO and more like a force of nature about to hit the shore. As the jet's wheels touched the tarmac, they didn't wait for a staircase, the cargo ramp lowered while they were still taxiing, and Ethan led a phalanx of elite security into the waiting black SUVs, the rain of the East Coast greeting them like a familiar, cold enemy. They reached the estate gates just as the titanium plates Zaria had installed began to groan and slide back, overridden by Sterling's master key. Ethan didn't wait for a tactical breach. He drove the lead SUV through the iron gates, the sound of twisting metal and shattering glass signaling the end of the secret era. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and old secrets, and as they reached the hidden vault, they found Arthur Sterling standing over Junho's chair, a silver injector in his hand and a look of cold, calculated arrogance on his face. "You're too late, Ethan," Sterling sneered, his voice projecting with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. "If I press this, your brother's heart stops, and the $900 billion trust defaults to the primary creditors, me." Zaria stepped forward, her regal natural hair dampened by the rain but her mahogany skin glowing with a terrifying, celestial authority as she raised her tablet, a single red button glowing on the screen. "Actually, Arthur, I didn't just lock the doors, I rerouted the estate's power grid through the Sterling global servers 10 minutes ago," Zaria said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade that made the billionaire's eyes go wide with a sudden, sharp fear. "If you touch that injector, I trigger a data wipe that will erase every offshore account, every deed, and every penny your family has hidden in Cyprus and the Caymans." The stalemate held for a heartbeat that felt like a century, the power of a global empire hanging on the twitch of a finger, until Ethan moved with the speed of a strike team leader, disarming Sterling and pinning him against the cold vault wall in a single, fluid motion. Zaria rushed to Junho's side, her hands steady as she checked his vitals, her voice a soft, maternal comfort that seemed to pull the ghost back from the edge of the abyss. "You're safe now, Junho," she whispered, her eyes meeting Ethan's in a look of profound, shared victory as the federal marshals swarmed the room to take Arthur Sterling into custody. 3 hours later, as the sun began to rise over the Connecticut hills, Ethan and Zaria stood on the grand balcony of the mansion. The world's press gathered on the lawn below like a sea of hungry shadows. Ethan didn't wait for a PR team. He took the microphone, his arm wrapping around Zaria's waist in a gesture of absolute, unyielding possession that was broadcast to every screen from California to New York. "For 3 years, the world saw this woman as a servant," Ethan announced, his voice a thunderous declaration that shook the very foundations of high society. "But tonight, you saw the truth. Zaria Reed Park is the architect of this family's survival, the mother to my brother's heir, and the only queen this empire will ever answer to." He dropped to one knee again, not in a museum this time, but in his own home, in front of the world, taking Zaria's hand and kissing her knuckles with a reverence that made the reporters go silent. "I married her in a secret chapel because I wasn't worthy of her light then," Ethan said, his voice thick with an emotion that billions could never buy. "But today, I ask her to lead this dynasty by my side, not as a secret, but as the soul of Park Aerospace." Zaria looked out at the horizon, her eyes reflecting the dawn of a new world where the Nanny was the most powerful woman in the room, her hand tightening around Ethan's as she felt the weight of the last 3 years finally transform into a crown. Madam Park was headed for a federal cell, the Huntingtons were in ruins, and Junho was finally breathing free air, a triad of justice that Zaria had built with nothing but her brilliance and her natural hair. "The storm is over, Ethan," Zaria whispered, her voice a promise that echoed through the morning air. "But our story is just beginning." If you've enjoyed this epic journey of a hidden queen and her protective alpha, make sure to subscribe and watch the next series, because when a billionaire falls in love with a woman like Zaria, the world is never the same again. Outside, the city was waking up to the news of the new Reed Park era, a world where the underdog didn't just win, she took over the board.